بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين. قال تعالى في كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For those of you who've tuned in to the Friday sermons the past couple of weeks, a topic that we mentioned was emotional intelligence. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is the subject of intelligence from an Islamic perspective. And this talk is no way meant to be a comprehensive, all-encompassing talk, but we'll just hit on a couple of subjects, inshallah. So, what are the Islamic perspectives on intelligence? And the reality is that intelligence, and we mentioned this before, is that there are multiple intelligences. And one of the first researchers, one of the early researchers, I should say, in the 20th century to describe the theory of multiple intelligences was a man by the name of Howard Gardner, who was a Harvard researcher. Before we go into that, let's look at what the Islamic perspective, the Islamic scriptural perspective on intelligence is. So number one, the term that is commonly associated with the intellect is aql. And that's a term that appears multiple times in the Quran and also in the Hadith. So you read verses that end with أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ. Do they not think? That's how it's commonly interpreted. But aql and the idea of the intellect is much more than just thinking and rationalization and reasoning. And to paint the picture further, I want to share with you a narration from Al-Kafi. And this is in fact the first narration in the book of Al-Kafi. For those of you who are familiar with Al-Kafi, it is the primary hadith text in the Shi'i school of law or the Shi'i school of thought. And it's a very extensive text. It contains around 16,000 narrations, not all of which are authentic, but many of them are. And so the first book of Al-Kafi is referred to as Kitabul Aql. Now I have here an English translated version. This is the one produced by Taqwa Media. For those of you who want to get your hands on Al-Kafi, I highly recommend this English translation. It's available online. And let's go to the first narration. The first narration says the following. It says, and it's from the fifth Imam, Al-Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam. And I'll just read to you the English translation. It says that when God created intellect, He gave it the faculty of language and said. So God creates intellect before He creates humankind, and He gives it the ability to speak. He said to it, "Come forward," whereupon it came forward. Then He said to it, "Go back," whereupon it went back. Then He said, "By my might and my majesty, I have not created a creature more beloved to me than you. And I have not perfected you except in whom I love. Let it be known, you alone do I command, and you alone do I forbid. According to you alone do I punish, and according to you alone I confer reward." So there's a lot to unpack here, but the fact is the first narration in the most important book, hadith book, I should say, in the Shi'i school of thought, places its emphasis on the creation of the intellect. Before, rituals, before prayer, fasting, all of that is the intellect, the emphasis on the intellect. So we'll come back to this, but I just want to take a step back and talk about the idea of the intellect and intelligence, and what is really the Islamic perspective on intelligence. Now, like I said, the theory of multiple intelligences, and one of the first people who spoke about that was Howard Gardner, and this is his book that he wrote called Frames of Mind, The Theory of Multiple Intelligences. This was printed in 1984. And basically what he's saying and arguing in this book is that we are all born with the potential to develop a multiplicity of intelligences, most of which have been overlooked in our testing society, which means that when you look at testing today, when you look at, for instance, standardized testing, what he's arguing is that most of the standardized testing today doesn't look at doesn't address the multiplicity of intelligences. It's only looking at maybe one or two types of intelligence, and all of which, these intelligences, can be drawn upon to make us competent individuals. So the idea here is, in the search or in the pursuit of how to build a competent individual in society, we need to not only look at IQ. It's not just brain power. And when we define intelligence, it's not just one type of intelligence. There are multiple types of intelligence. And of course, in the book, he talks about linguistic intelligence. He talks about musical intelligence, body and kinesthetic intelligence. These are all different forms of intelligences that a human being can acquire and even grow in. So people can be talented or gifted in these areas, but they can also develop these different intelligences. They could also develop these different capacities. And I just want to share maybe a couple of passages from what he has to say. And obviously this is a book that was developed after, and the theory in the book was developed after many years of psychology and neuropsychology. But on the onset, he says something which I believe was pretty interesting, and it'll come up later when we look at the Islamic definition of intelligence. But he says that reason, intelligence, logic, and knowledge are not synonymous. What does that mean? Sometimes when we throw these words around, when we talk about reason, intelligence, logic, knowledge, we use them synonymously, meaning that we use we use all these words to sort of pursue one meaning and one purpose. And the fact is, what he's saying here is, no, reason, intelligence, logic, and knowledge are not synonymous to one another. Think about it. We know people who, based on IQ, are highly intelligent. However, they have little to no common sense. What does that tell you about the person? That their strength in their intelligence is only good for one area. It's not good for every area. And this actually comes up when we define what the intellect or Akal is in the book of Al-Kafi. We'll go back to that in a few minutes. But think about that. You know people who have knowledge, maybe they've read a lot of books or attended a lot of courses. They have multiple degrees, but they have very little common sense. Or logically, they don't know how to solve certain problems. So what he's saying is that it's much more than just saying that someone is intelligent. Well, when we're talking about intelligence, what do we mean specifically? There are multiple types of intelligence. One of the earliest scholars to address this was a Swiss psychologist by the name of Jean Piaget. And he was one of the early developers of, or early theorists, I should say, of the area of cognitive development. What he started to do is he witnessed his own children. He had 3 children, and how they developed from babies, into being toddlers, and then being children and adults, and the way that they picked up on certain things and the way that they would learn. And what he says is the following. This is how Howard Gardner describes him. He says, Piaget came to believe that it is not the accuracy of the child's response that is important. I want you to think about that for a minute. When we're testing someone in school, when we're testing a child, a student in school, what do we look for? We look for the accuracy in the child's response. But rather, he's saying the following. It's not the accuracy of the child's response that was important, but rather the lines of reasoning the child invokes. Not necessarily about the answer, but rather about the line of reasoning. How did you get to that answer? I remember in school, I had a math teacher who, when we'd solve a problem on a test or on homework, if it was worth 10 points, would give 9 points based off of the reasoning. We had to actually show our work, and then 1 point based off the answer, or based on the answer. So essentially, you can do the work correctly, and then maybe you wrote it out, the answer, as a mistake. Maybe you were missing a digit, or you added a digit, or something like that, but you'd still get most of the credit. So it was not the answer itself, but rather the line of reasoning. Why is this important? Because 1400 years ago, Imam Ali alayhi salam said the following when he described the intellect. He said the intellect is what arrives at what is correct through reasoning. Not just knowing the answer, but how'd you get to the answer? The purpose of knowledge, going to school for so many years, is not that we could just have answers to questions. The purpose of knowledge, when you pursue an education, whether it be undergrad or graduate school or whatever it is, or certificate program, or even education on your own, the purpose isn't just to have an answer to everything. The purpose is to teach us lines of reasoning. How do you solve a problem? When you're posed the question, what is the line of reasoning that you're using, right? So that is more important in our cognitive development than having all of the answers. So that's when it comes to some of the earlier views on intelligence, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that. I want to go back to the tradition in Al-Kafi. But if you remember the tradition in Al-Kafi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it describes him as having created the intellect. He gave it the faculty of language. He told it to come forward. It came forward. He told it to move back. It went back. And then he said, by my might and my majesty, I have not created a creature more beloved to me than you. And I have not perfected you except in whom I love. Think about that. When God truly loves someone, he gives him or her good intellect. Intelligence then becomes a sign of love from God. And I have not perfected you except in whom I love. Let it be known. You alone do I command, and you alone do I forbid. What does that mean? That means when God commands us and forbids us, he is addressing the aql, the intellect. So a person with no intelligence, there's nothing much that's really expected from them. According to you alone do I punish, and according to you alone do I confer reward. The more we understand, the more we know, the higher our intelligence level is, the more is expected from us. So this is the hadith, and obviously there's a commentary on the hadith. And again, Muslim scholars use the word aql to mean many different things. But in the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his immaculate progeny, they use that word, aql, which we commonly associate with intellect, to mean four things only. Number one, The first meaning of aql is the faculty of intellect or reason. When you say someone has the ability to reason, right? By which human beings understand all things, among them which are good and evil, and by which they differentiate among them. I want you to think about that. Knowing the difference between good and evil. If you were just to take the word aql, intellect, and restrict it to the definition of having knowledge or logic or data, that doesn't really tell us anything about good or bad. But here, it's a deeper meaning. It's knowing the difference between good and bad. So how do we strengthen it in this regard? According to the traditions, it is possible to strengthen this intellectual capacity. If you're thinking, well, how do I strengthen my intellectual capacity? By, among other things, abstaining from sin. The more we abstain from sin, the stronger our intellect. Learning and teaching. When you learn, obviously your intelligence increases, but also when you teach. Exercising discipline. Think about that. Think about just the bare bones minimum meaning of intellect. You wouldn't necessarily associate it with discipline, but discipline increases intellect. Learning from experience, reflection. They say pain plus reflection equals progress. It's not just pain. Some people go through their entire life and they mess up and they expect to become wiser on the other side, which is why so many people do not acquire wisdom in their life. It's because they're not reflecting on what's happening in their life. So pain plus reflection equals progress. And also submitting to the truth. When you find the truth and submit to it, that increases your intelligence, your intellect. So this is one meaning, intellect or reason by which human beings understand all things. A second meaning is basically to have an intellect. And so what that corresponds with is basically that God has provided a man or a woman with enough intellect that he can hold him or her responsible for their actions. Some people we know, and the Quran, of course, addresses the different categories of people that may fall short, that much is not really expected, that, you know, they can kind of slide and we can't really hold them as responsible or as accountable, right? So if you've heard the term safih, someone who, some define it as handicapped, but safih is really someone who just can't get a grip over their own affairs, right? They don't know how to handle money. They don't know how to handle relationships. There's something that's holding them back, all right? Or those who are insane, majnoon, those who are handicapped in another way. That is basically that is a person who does not have that full aql, to have an intellect, which is the second meaning. The third is to use one's intellect. So it's used as a verb. So when you come across the verses in the Quran that says, أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ, do they not use, it's not, do they not have an intellect? The Quran is saying, do they not use their intellect? It's there. They have the capacity. They just haven't discovered it. You know, when it comes to their decisions, they're just whatever. They don't use their intellect at all. So that's the third meaning, and here it says, of course, understanding something and not acting accordingly is tantamount to not understanding at all. There's an important point here. If you're going to go get financial advice, are you going to go get financial advice from the guy who's broke and millions of dollars in debt? If you're going to go get fitness advice, are you going to go get fitness advice from the guy who's completely out of shape, doesn't exercise or doesn't eat right? So there's a difference between understanding something and acting accordingly. If you understand something and you don't act accordingly, it is tantamount to not understanding at all. And this is the third meaning, is to actually use your intellect. And the fourth, and here's the interesting one, is that it's used to mean to use one's intellect for the right purpose. Because you could be smart, you could have high IQ, you can be intelligent, but you use it the wrong way. And it's in this sense that in another tradition, and I'll read quickly through that tradition, that Al-Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam, the sixth Imam, he says that Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, when he describes him, he lacks intellect because he did not do the right thing with what he knew. So let's go to that narration really quick, and it's just two narrations over, where the narrator asks the Imam, he asks him, what is the intellect? Mal aql. What is the intellect? The Imam replies, it is that by which God, all beneficent, is worshipped and the gardens are earned. Right? Which reflects what that first narration says. So the narrator asked the question. He said, I asked him, then what was the trait in Muawiyah? فَالَّذِي كَانَ فِي Muawiyah? Because, I mean, he was cunning. He knew how to scheme. He knew how to plot. He knew how to get what he wanted. The Imam replies, he says, تِلْكَ النَّكْرَاء تِلْكَ الشَّيْطَنَةِ. He says, that was cleverness. That was devilry. It is similar to intellect, but it is not intellect. So sometimes you'll see someone who sounds smart, looks smart, is smart on paper, but that characteristic of aql that's mentioned in the Quran and in the hadith does not apply to them. Because that fourth meaning of aql is to use your intellect for the right purposes. Not in a scheming way, not in a plotting way, not in a devilish way. They asked one time Warren Buffett, famous multi-billionaire, what he looks for when he wants to partner with someone or when he wants to hire someone. He said 3 attributes: intelligence, integrity, and energy. Which means that if you have, and he explained, he said, if you have intelligence and you have energy, but you have no integrity, then you'll just have a fast-moving thief. Because he's high energy, he can get things done, and at the same time he knows what he's doing, but he has no integrity. You'll have a fast-moving thief. And so, in the Islamic perspective, the intellect itself carries the meaning of integrity and character and doing the right thing. So when the Quran speaks about integrity, when the Quran speaks about intelligence or the intellect, what it's also referring to is doing the right thing. Another tradition from Imam Ali alayhi salam says the following. He says, the intellect is better than desire, for the intellect makes you a king over your destiny, and desire makes you a slave of your destiny. Think about that. What he's talking about here is intellect, not just street smarts, but doing the right thing. So there's integrity in there. There's character, which is molded into that definition of intellect. And that is what some scholars have referred to as an-nafsul mutma'inna. In that verse in the Holy Quran, Ya ayyatuha an-nafsul mutma'inna, when God refers to that soul that is ready to return to its Lord. What he's talking about here is the conscience, that part of the soul, that part of the intellect that knows the difference between right and wrong. Moving beyond just the intellect, there's also what is known as spiritual intelligence. And spiritual intelligence is a level above all other intelligences. And just to end it quick and just to share that definition quickly with you, what spiritual intelligence refers to is our drive for meaning and connection with the infinite. which is related to our conscious, which is the inward moral sense of what is right and what is wrong, and the drive toward meaning and contribution. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we are counted among those that He loves and that He perfects within us our intellect. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَيْكُمْ وَرَحْمَةُ اللَّهِ وَبَرَكَاتُهُ.